She once inherited a crumbling cabin, thinking it held nothing but memories, until a hidden wall and a steel safe, marked with a gangster's initials, revealed a fortune that would change everything. No one expected the quiet farm girl to uncover Al Capone's most guarded secret. But sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries are buried in the most ordinary places, waiting for someone brave enough to look beyond the surface. The morning mist clung to the Illinois cornfields like secrets, refusing to be told, drifting across acres of land that had belonged to the Morrison family for 3 generations. Sarah Morrison stood at the edge of her grandfather's property, her designer boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, feeling completely out of place in her tailored business suit. At 28, she had built what everyone called a perfect life. Her consulting firm in Chicago specialized in corporate restructuring, turning failing businesses into profitable ventures, with the cold precision of a surgeon removing diseased tissue. The financial magazines had featured her twice in the past year. The turnaround queen, they called her, always photographed in sharp blazers with her auburn hair pulled back severely, her green eyes focused with laser intensity on whatever acquisition or merger dominated her attention. Her penthouse apartment overlooked Lake Michigan, filled with modern furniture that cost more than most people's cars, every surface clean and purposeful. She drove a Tesla, ate at restaurants where reservations required a month's notice, and dated a hedge fund manager who talked about their relationship like it was another portfolio to optimize. But standing here in the field where she'd spent childhood summers chasing fireflies and learning to drive her grandfather's ancient pickup truck, none of that felt real. Her phone buzzed constantly in her pocket, clients demanding updates, her assistant scheduling meetings that stretched into the evening hours. She had more money than she'd ever dreamed of as a little girl, more success than her parents had imagined, possible when she left for college on a scholarship. Yet something hollow echoed in her chest, a feeling she'd been pushing down for months with longer work hours and busier schedules. Her grandfather, Thomas Morrison, had died 3 weeks ago at 87, taking with him stories that Sarah realized she'd never really listened to when she was young, and thought she had forever to hear them. He'd been a farmer his entire life, working this land with hands that knew every season, every mood of the soil, every secret the earth whispered to those patient enough to listen. The funeral had been small, attended mostly by neighbors whose families had known the Morrisons for decades, people who spoke in gentle voices about Thomas's kindness, his quiet wisdom, the way he could fix anything that was broken and never asked for credit. Sarah had inherited everything: the 200-acre farm, the old farmhouse where 3 generations had been born, and the cabin. The cabin had always been Thomas's retreat, a small structure he'd built himself in the 1960s, tucked into a grove of oak trees about a quarter-mile from the main house. As a child, Sarah had been fascinated by it, but Thomas had always seemed protective of the space, letting her visit only occasionally, usually keeping their conversations to the front porch rather than inviting her inside. Now, walking toward the cabin through tall grass that brushed against her expensive clothes, Sarah felt like an intruder. Her grandfather had left specific instructions that she was to handle his affairs personally, not through lawyers or estate managers. It seemed strange for a man who had lived such a simple life to be so particular about the details, but Thomas had always been quietly stubborn about things that mattered to him. The cabin looked smaller than she remembered, its wooden walls weathered, silver gray by decades of Illinois weather. The roof needed repair, and the small porch sagged slightly on one side. Morning glory vines had claimed the latticework around the foundation, their purple flowers the only spot of color in the muted landscape. Sarah pulled the key from her pocket, the same brass key Thomas had carried on a ring, with only 2 others, worn smooth by his fingers. The door opened with a creak that sounded like a sigh, revealing a space that felt frozen in time. The furniture, was simple and handmade: a wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed covered with a quilt that Sarah remembered from her grandmother's hands. But what struck her most was how clean everything was, how carefully maintained despite the cabin's external appearance of neglect. Books lined shelves along one wall, their spines faded but tidy. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its hearth swept clean, logs stacked neatly beside it. Sarah moved through the space slowly, running her fingers along surfaces that held the weight of her grandfather's solitude. This had been his sanctuary, she realized, the place he came when the world felt too loud or demanding. She found letters in a drawer, correspondence with other farmers about crop rotations and weather patterns, written in Thomas's careful handwriting. There were photographs tucked into the pages of books, pictures of the land in different seasons, images of harvests and storms and the quiet beauty of rural life. But it was when she moved the heavy wooden desk to clean behind it that she noticed something odd. The wall behind the desk looked different from the others, newer somehow, though she couldn't put her finger on why. The wood paneling was the same throughout the cabin, but this section seemed to sit differently, as if it had been removed and replaced. Sarah pressed her hand against the wall, feeling for anything unusual. Her fingers found a slight gap where 2 boards met, barely visible unless you were looking for it. When she pressed against the board, it gave slightly, making a soft, clicking sound. The entire section of wall swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a space behind it that Sarah never would have suspected existed. The hidden room was small, no more than 6 feet square, but it was clearly intentional. The walls were lined with the same wood paneling as the main cabin, and the floor was solid concrete. Built into the far wall was a large steel safe, old-fashioned and imposing, its black surface unmarked by rust, despite what must have been decades in this hidden space. But what made Sarah's breath catch in her throat were the initials etched into the steel, just above the combination dial. Sarah stared at the letters, her mind racing through possibilities. The safe was clearly old, probably from the 1920s or 1930s, based on its design. It was the kind of thing that belonged in a bank or a wealthy person's office, completely out of place in a simple farmer's cabin. The craftsmanship was exceptional, heavy steel construction that spoke of serious security, the kind of protection someone would use for something truly valuable. She tried the handle, but the safe was locked tight. The combination dial turned smoothly, suggesting it had been maintained over the years, but without the combination, she had no way to open it. Sarah ran her hands along the safe's surface, looking for any other clues, any hint of what her grandfather had hidden here and why. The implications of the initials began to settle in her mind, like sediment in still water. AC, in a safe from the 1920s or 1930s, hidden in a secret room in rural Illinois, not far from Chicago. The pieces of a puzzle she didn't understand were falling into place, and the picture they suggested seemed impossible. Al Capone had owned property throughout Illinois during Prohibition. Everyone knew the stories, the way he'd used rural hideouts and safe houses to store money, weapons and liquor away from federal agents and rival gangs. But those were stories, legends, the kind of tales that grew larger with each telling. The idea that her grandfather, quiet Thomas Morrison, who'd spent his life growing corn and soybeans, had somehow come to possess Al Capone's personal safe, seemed like something from a movie. Sarah backed out of the hidden room and sat down heavily in one of the wooden chairs, staring at the secret entrance that had been concealed behind her grandfather's desk for who knows how many years. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what she'd discovered. Everything she thought she knew about her family, about this land, about her grandfather's simple life, had shifted in the space of a few minutes. The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin's windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Sarah pulled out her phone to call someone, to share this incredible discovery, but stopped with her finger hovering over the screen. Who would she call? Her parents had moved to Florida years ago and barely remembered the details of the farm. Her assistant would think she'd lost her mind. The hedge fund manager she'd been dating would immediately start calculating the potential value and tax implications. For the first time in years, Sarah felt completely alone with something that mattered. Not alone in the sense of being isolated or abandoned, but alone in the way that happens when you discover something so significant that sharing it casually would diminish its power. This was her grandfather's secret, passed to her through inheritance and chance, and she realized that whatever came next would have to come from her own decisions, her own courage. She walked back to the hidden room and stood before the safe. Again, studying every detail of its construction, every mark on its surface. The steel was cold under her palm, holding decades of secrets behind its locked door. Thomas had protected this secret his entire life, had built a room to hide it, had never spoken of it to anyone as far as she knew. Why had he kept it? What had he planned to do with whatever was inside? The questions multiplied in her mind, but underneath them was a growing sense of excitement that she hadn't felt in years. For so long, her life had been about managing other people's problems, optimizing systems that someone else had built, finding profit in structures that already existed. This was different. This was discovery, mystery, the possibility of uncovering something that could change everything. Sarah locked the cabin and drove back to Chicago that evening, but her mind remained in the hidden room with the mysterious safe. She sat in her pristine apartment, surrounded by the symbols of her success, and realized that for the first time since college, she was thinking about something other than work. The safe had awakened something in her that had been dormant for years, a sense of wonder and possibility that her corporate life had systematically trained out of her. That night, she dreamed of her grandfather, not as the old man she'd known in recent years, but as he might have been in the 1930s, young and strong, keeping a secret that could have gotten him killed. In the dream, he was trying to tell her something, but his words were lost in the sound of wind through cornfields, leaving her with only the memory of his gentle eyes and the feeling that she was meant to understand something important. The next morning arrived grey and restless, with clouds pressing low over Chicago's skyline like a heavy quilt. Sarah sat in her corner office on the 42nd floor, staring out at Lake Michigan, while her assistant rattled through the day's schedule. 3 client meetings, a conference call with investors in Tokyo, a presentation to the board of directors, for a manufacturing company that was hemorrhaging money. The familiar rhythm of corporate crisis management that had once energized her now felt like background noise, important but somehow distant. She found herself sketching combinations on the margin of her meeting notes. Birth dates, anniversaries, significant years from the 1920s. The safe's combination dial had looked well maintained, suggesting her grandfather had opened it regularly, but that didn't narrow down the possibilities. Sarah had always been good with puzzles, the kind of logical problem-solving that made her excellent at corporate restructuring. But this felt different, personal. The steel safe with those enigmatic initials had lodged itself in her thoughts, like a splinter, impossible to ignore. During her lunch break, instead of reviewing quarterly reports, Sarah found herself in the Chicago Public Library's history section, pulling books about Prohibition-era crime in Illinois. The librarian, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, seemed delighted to help someone research local history. She directed Sarah to archives that detailed Al Capone's operations, his network of speakeasies, gambling houses, and safe houses that stretched throughout the Chicago metropolitan area and into rural Illinois. The more Sarah read, the more plausible her theory became. Capone had been methodical about hiding assets, storing cash and valuables in multiple locations to protect them from federal raids and rival gangs. Rural properties were particularly valuable because they were isolated, less likely to draw attention from law enforcement. The timeline fit perfectly with when her great-grandfather had owned the land, and there were documented cases of Capone's organization using farms and rural properties throughout the region. But what struck Sarah most in her research was learning about the farmers and rural residents who had, willingly or unwillingly, become involved with organized crime during Prohibition. Some had been intimidated into cooperation, threatened with violence if they didn't allow their property to be used. Others had been paid handsomely for their silence and cooperation. A few had stumbled into situations they never intended, finding themselves protecting secrets that could have destroyed their families if revealed. She wondered which category her great-grandfather had fallen into. Thomas had never spoken much about his father, Sarah realized. The family stories that had been passed down focused on the farm's establishment, the hard work of building a life from the soil, the gradual accumulation of land and prosperity. But there had always been gaps in the narrative, periods where the details became vague, where Thomas would change the subject or simply say that some things were better left in the past. That evening, Sarah called her mother from her apartment, trying to sound casual as she asked about family history. Her mother, Helen, was in her 70s now and spent most of her time in retirement communities in Florida, playing bridge and complaining about the heat. She seemed surprised to hear from Sarah on a weeknight, when work usually consumed all of her daughter's attention. "I've been going through Grandpa's things," Sarah said, curling up on her minimalist sofa with a glass of wine. "I found some old photographs and documents. I was wondering what you remember about his father, about the early days of the farm." Helen's voice took on the distant quality it always had when discussing the past. "Oh, your great-grandfather was before my time, of course. He died when your grandfather was just a young man. I know it was hard on the family, losing him so suddenly. Your grandfather never talked much about those early years, said some memories were better left buried." "Do you remember anything about the cabin, when Grandpa built it?" "The cabin." Helen paused, and Sarah could hear the sound of ice clinking in a glass. "That's funny you should ask. I always thought that was odd, how secretive he was about that little place. Built it in the early 1960s, I think, right after your grandmother. And I started dating. He was very particular about it, did all the work himself, wouldn't let anyone help. Your grandmother used to tease him about having his own private retreat." Sarah pressed gently for more details, but Helen's memory for specifics had never been strong, and the conversation eventually drifted to complaints about her bridge partner's tendency to overbid. But something in her mother's tone when she'd mentioned the cabin being built in the 1960s stuck with Sarah. If the safe was from the 1920s or 1930s, it predated the cabin by decades. Thomas hadn't built the cabin to hide the safe. He'd built it around something that was already there. The next day was Saturday, and instead of her usual routine of catching up on work emails and reviewing client files, Sarah drove back to the farm. The morning was crisp and clear. Autumn, beginning to show itself in the changing colors of the maple trees that lined the country roads. She felt a sense of anticipation that reminded her of childhood Christmas mornings, that flutter of excitement mixed with nervous energy that comes from knowing something significant is about to happen. This time, she came prepared. She'd stopped at a hardware store and bought a high-powered flashlight, work gloves, and a small crowbar, though she hoped she wouldn't need to force anything open. She'd also brought a notebook to record whatever she found, approaching this mystery with the same methodical attention to detail that made her successful in business. The cabin felt different in the daylight, less mysterious, but somehow more substantial. Sarah spent time examining the structure more carefully, looking for clues about its construction and history. The foundation was older than she'd initially realized, with stones that looked like they'd been placed decades before the 1960s. The cabin hadn't been built from scratch. It had been built around something that was already there. In the hidden room, Sarah studied the safe more carefully, running her flashlight over every inch of its surface. The steel was remarkably well preserved, with only minor scratches and scuffs that suggested regular but careful use. The combination dial moved smoothly, and she could see that the mechanism had been maintained over the years. This wasn't an abandoned relic. It was a functional safe that someone had cared for. She began systematically trying combinations, starting with dates that might have been significant to her family or to Al Capone. Birth dates, death dates, important years in Chicago history. She tried 1920, the year Prohibition began. 1931, the year Capone was finally convicted. 1925, which she'd read was one of his most profitable years. Each failed attempt felt like a small defeat, but Sarah was persistent by nature, and the mystery only deepened her determination. It was when she tried her great-grandfather's birth year, 1899, that she heard a different sound from the safe's mechanism. Not the solid click of the lock engaging, but a softer sound, like something shifting inside. She tried the year her grandfather was born, 1937, and heard the same subtle change. Sarah realized she was getting closer to something, even if she wasn't sure what. She sat back on her heels, thinking about the family timeline. Her great-grandfather had died in 1941, which would have been during the early years of World War II. Her grandfather had been only 4 years old, far too young to understand or remember complex family secrets. If there was a connection to Ali, Capone's organization, it would have been through her great-grandfather, and any knowledge of the safe's combination would have died with him, unless he had left clues somewhere. Sarah began searching the cabin more methodically, looking for anything that might contain numbers or dates. She went through the books on the shelves, checking for underlined passages or margin notes. She examined the photographs for dates written on the back. She even checked the furniture for carved initials or hidden compartments, though she felt slightly foolish doing so. It was in an old farming journal, tucked between pages of weather observations and crop yield records, that she found what she was looking for. Not the combination itself, but something that made her heart race with possibility. Written in her grandfather's careful handwriting was a single line. Some locks can only be opened by those who understand the weight of keeping silent. Below, it in different ink as if added later, were 3 numbers, 18, 7, 73. Sarah stared at the numbers, trying to understand their significance. They weren't dates in any obvious format, and they didn't correspond to any family birthdays or anniversaries she could remember. But something about them felt intentional, like they belonged together for a reason she hadn't figured out yet. She tried them as a combination, 18, 7, 73. Nothing. She tried them in different orders, 73, 18 to 7, 7 to 73, 18. Still nothing. But as she sat in the hidden room, looking at the numbers in her grandfather's handwriting, she began to think about codes, about the ways people hide information in plain sight. 18 could be the 18th letter of the alphabet. R7 could be G. 73 could be. Sarah counted carefully. SRGS didn't mean anything to her, but what if the numbers represented something else entirely? She tried thinking about them as coordinates, as mathematical formulas, as references to pages in books. None of it felt right, but then she remembered something from her research about Al Capone, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time. Capone had been obsessive about security, but he'd also been known for using personal references in his codes and passwords. Names of family members, significant locations, important dates in his life. What if the numbers weren't arbitrary? What if they referred to something specific about Capone himself, something that her great-grandfather would have known? Sarah pulled out her phone and began searching for information about Al Capone's life, looking for connections to the numbers 18, 7, and 73. It took nearly an hour of cross-referencing dates and events before she found something that made her pulse quicken. Al Capone had been born on January 17, 1899. The seventh month of the year was July, and if you reversed the digits of 37, his age when he was convicted, you got 73. The numbers weren't random at all. They were a code based on Capone's birth date and the circumstances of his downfall. Sarah tried the combination with this new understanding. 17, his birth date. 7, July, his birth month. 37, his age at conviction. The dial turned smoothly through each number, and when she turned the handle, she heard the distinctive sound of heavy mechanisms moving inside the safe. The door swung open with surprising ease, revealing an interior that was larger than she'd expected. And what she found inside would change everything she thought she knew about her family, about the farm, and about the quiet life her grandfather had lived in. The shadow of a secret that had shaped 3 generations. The safe's interior was meticulously organized, as if someone had spent years arranging and rearranging its contents with the precision of a museum curator. Sarah's flashlight beam revealed neat stacks of cash bundled with rubber bands that had long since deteriorated, leaving trails of black residue on bills that bore dates from the 1920s and early 1930s. The money was old, but remarkably well preserved in the dry environment of the hidden room. She estimated there were thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands, though she'd need to count carefully to be sure. But the money, significant as it was, seemed almost secondary to the other items in the safe. There were documents in manila, envelopes, their edges yellowed with age, but their contents protected from decades of Illinois humidity. Photographs wrapped in tissue paper showed men in suits and fedoras standing outside buildings Sarah didn't recognize. Their faces serious, their postures suggesting the kind of casual authority that comes with power and danger. At the very back of the safe, almost hidden behind the stacks of cash, was a leather journal bound with a string that had once been white but had darkened to cream with age. Sarah lifted it carefully, surprised by its weight. The leather was soft and supple despite its age, suggesting it had been made with care and maintained with respect. When she opened it, she found pages covered with handwriting in 2 different styles. The first handwriting was unfamiliar, angular and confident, written in fountain pen ink that had faded to brown. The entries were dated, starting in 1928 and continuing through 1940, and they detailed what appeared to be financial transactions, deliveries of liquor to various locations throughout Illinois, payments made to farmers and property owners, arrangements for storage and transportation. The amounts mentioned were staggering, thousands of dollars changing hands for what the journal euphemistically called storage fees and transportation assistance. But it was the second handwriting that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. This script was careful and familiar, the same neat penmanship she'd seen in her grandfather's letters and farming records, Thomas Morrison writing in pencil beneath. The original ink entries had added his own observations and thoughts. His notes were sparse but revealing, the record of a young man trying to understand a situation that had been thrust upon him by circumstances beyond his control. "Father never wanted any part of this," read one entry, dated 1941. "Said the money was cursed, that it would bring nothing but trouble to our family. But after he died, I found myself the keeper of secrets I never asked to know." Sarah sat on the concrete floor of the hidden room, the journal open in her lap, reading by flashlight as the afternoon shadows lengthened outside the cabin. The story that emerged from the pages was nothing like the family history she'd grown up hearing. Her great-grandfather, Martin Morrison, had been approached by representatives of Al Capone's organization in 1928 when the farm was struggling. financially due to a series of bad harvests and falling crop prices. The arrangement had been presented as a simple business transaction. Capone's people needed secure locations to store money and valuable items away from Chicago, where federal agents were constantly conducting raids. Rural properties were ideal because they were isolated, unlikely to draw attention, and their owners could be motivated by financial need to cooperate. Martin Morrison was offered a substantial sum to allow a safe to be installed on his property and to maintain absolute silence about its existence. According to the journal, Martin had initially refused. He was a religious man who disapproved of drinking and gambling, and he wanted no part of criminal enterprise. But the financial pressure on the farm was severe, and the representatives made it clear that his cooperation would be rewarded while his refusal might have consequences for his family's safety. Faced with the possibility of losing the farm that had been in his family for 2 generations, Martin had reluctantly agreed. The safe had been installed in a root cellar that already existed on the property, a stone-lined underground space that had been used for food storage. Capone's men had reinforced the structure, added the hidden entrance, and installed the safe with explicit instructions about its care and maintenance. Martin was given the combination and told that the safe would be accessed periodically by authorized representatives, but that his primary responsibility was to ensure its security and secrecy. What Martin hadn't anticipated was how the arrangement would evolve over time. The entries in the journal showed that the safe was used not just for storing cash, but for documents, photographs, and other materials that Capone's organization needed to keep hidden. Some of the documents appeared to be insurance policies, ensuring that key people would remain loyal by giving Capone leverage over them. Others were records of legitimate businesses that served as fronts for illegal operations. Thomas's additions to the journal revealed the psychological burden of inheriting this secret. When Martin died suddenly of a heart attack in 1941, 4-year-old Thomas became the unwitting heir to a situation he couldn't possibly understand. For years, no one came to access the safe, and Thomas grew up knowing only that his father had hidden something important that was never to be discussed. It wasn't until Thomas was in his 20s and Al Capone had died in 1947 that he fully understood what he'd inherited. By then, the original purpose of the safe had become irrelevant, but the contents remained. Thomas had spent years wrestling with what to do about it, ultimately deciding that the safest course was to protect the secret his father had died keeping. "I built the cabin around it," Thomas had written in 1962, "not to hide what was inside, but to give myself a place to think about it without the weight of family watching. Some burdens are meant to be carried alone, and some secrets die with the men who keep them." Sarah found herself crying as she read her grandfather's words, not from sadness, but from a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. Pride in the quiet courage he'd shown in protecting his family, sorrow for the loneliness of carrying such a burden, and something else, something that felt like recognition, as if she were finally understanding aspects of her grandfather's character. That had always seemed mysterious. The journal contained other revelations that painted a picture of rural Illinois during Prohibition that bore no resemblance to the sanitized history Sarah had learned in school. Farmers throughout the region had been drawn into Capone's network, some willingly and others through intimidation or financial desperation. The illegal liquor trade had been far more extensive and sophisticated than most people realized, reaching into communities that seemed far removed from Chicago's gangster culture. Among the documents in the safe were photographs that told their own story, images of well-dressed men loading trucks at rural locations, of money changing hands in what appeared to be barn lofts, of meetings held in cornfields where privacy was guaranteed by miles of empty farmland. One photograph showed a group of farmers standing beside expensive automobiles that clearly didn't belong in their modest rural community, their faces grim with the knowledge of what their cooperation had cost them in peace of mind. But perhaps the most significant document was a letter addressed to the current property owner, written in the same angular handwriting as the journal's original entries. The letter was dated 1940 and appeared to have been placed in the safe as a final communication from Capone's organization. To whoever finds this record, the letter began, the arrangements detailed in this journal are no longer active as of this date. The organization that created these agreements has been dissolved, and all obligations on both sides are considered fulfilled. The contents of this safe are now the property of the landowner to dispose of as they see fit. No further contact will be made regarding these matters. The letter was signed with initials that Sarah couldn't make out, but the meaning was clear. When Al Capone's empire finally collapsed under federal pressure, the rural network that had supported it was quietly disbanded. The farmers who had been drawn into the organization were released from their obligations, free to keep whatever compensation they had received and to forget their involvement if they chose. For Martin Morrison, however, forgetting had never been an option. The safe and its contents represented not just a financial windfall, but a moral burden that he couldn't resolve. The money had been earned through criminal enterprise, but it had also saved his farm and secured his family's future. Using it felt like profiting from crime. Not using it felt like wasting his father's sacrifice. Thomas had inherited this moral complexity along with the safe, and his journal entries revealed years of internal struggle. He had never spent any of the money, instead choosing to work the farm and build a modest but honest living from the land. But he had also never disposed of the contents, perhaps understanding that they represented a piece of history that was larger than his personal comfort. "Someday," Thomas had written in what appeared to be his final entry, dated just 2 years before his death, "someone in our family will be strong enough to decide what to do with this legacy. I pray they will be wiser than I have been, and braver than my father was able to be." Sarah closed the journal and sat in the growing darkness of the hidden room, overwhelmed by the weight of what she'd discovered. The safe contained not just money and documents, but the story of 3 generations of her family caught between moral principles and practical necessities. Her great-grandfather had made a choice to protect his family's survival. Her grandfather had made a choice to protect his father's secret. Now it was her turn to choose what to do with a legacy that was simultaneously a blessing and a burden. The implications were staggering, not just for Sarah personally, but for her understanding of her family's history and her own place in it. The farm hadn't just been built through hard work and perseverance, as she'd always been told. It had been saved by money from one of America's most notorious criminals, and that salvation had cast a shadow over 3 generations of Morrisons. As Sarah finally emerged from the cabin into the cool evening air, she realized that her life had been irrevocably changed by what she'd found in the safe. The successful business consultant who had driven out from Chicago that morning no longer existed. In her place was someone who carried the weight of family secrets, who understood that sometimes survival requires compromises that can't be easily categorized as right or wrong. The discovery had awakened something in her that went beyond mere curiosity about the past. For the first time in years, Sarah felt connected to something larger than quarterly profits and corporate restructuring. She was part of a story that stretched back decades, linked to events and people who had shaped American history in ways that textbooks never captured. The question now was what she would do with that knowledge, and how she would honor the courage and sacrifice of the men who had carried this secret before her. Sarah drove back to Chicago that evening with the leather journal beside her on the passenger seat, its weight somehow more significant than the expensive briefcase that usually occupied that space. The familiar skyline appeared through her windshield like a mirage, all glass and steel, reaching toward a darkening sky. But the city felt foreign now, as if she were seeing it through different eyes. The discovery in the safe had shifted something fundamental in her perception, not just of her family's history, but of the entire world around her. Her penthouse apartment, which had always represented the pinnacle of her achievements, now felt sterile and disconnected. The modern furniture and minimalist design that had once satisfied her aesthetic sense seemed empty of meaning, lacking the warmth and history that had saturated every corner of her grandfather's cabin. Sarah poured herself a glass of wine and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the lights of the city, while her mind remained in the hidden room with its secrets and shadows. Sleep came in fragments that night, interrupted by dreams, filled with men in fedoras and the sound of heavy safes clicking open in darkened rooms. When morning arrived, grey and persistent, Sarah found herself unable to focus on the stack of client files that demanded her attention. The corporate world that had once consumed her thoughts now felt like an elaborate game, important to its players, but ultimately disconnected from the deeper currents of human experience she'd touched in her grandfather's journal. She called her assistant and cancelled her morning meetings, claiming she needed to handle urgent family business related to the estate. It wasn't entirely a lie, though the urgency was more emotional than legal. Sarah spent the morning in the Chicago Public Library, this time researching not just Al Capone's operations, but the broader social and economic context of rural Illinois. During the Great Depression, what she discovered painted a picture of desperation that made her great-grandfather's choices more understandable. The agricultural crisis that had preceded the stock market crash of 1929 had devastated farming communities. Throughout the Midwest, banks had foreclosed on properties that had been in families for generations, leaving proud, hard-working people with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the bitter knowledge that forces beyond their control had destroyed everything they'd built. In this context, Capone's organization had offered more than just money. They'd offered survival. The farmers who had cooperated hadn't been motivated by greed, but by the fundamental human need to protect their families and preserve their way of life. The moral complexity of their situation was staggering, and Sarah began to understand why. Her grandfather had carried the burden of this knowledge for so long without resolution. She found records of other farms in the region that had been foreclosed during the same period her great-grandfather had faced financial ruin. The Morrison farm was one of the few that had survived, and now Sarah knew why. The money from Capone's organization had saved not just the land, but the future of everyone who would come after Martin Morrison. Sarah herself was a beneficiary of that morally ambiguous salvation, her education and opportunities made possible by choices her great-grandfather had made under impossible circumstances. The realization brought with it a sense of responsibility that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The money in the safe wasn't just currency, it was a debt to the past and an obligation to the future. How could she honor her family's sacrifices while acknowledging the source of their salvation? How could she make peace with a legacy that was simultaneously shameful and heroic? That afternoon, Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She drove back to the farm, not to retrieve the money, but to spend time in the place where these difficult choices had been made. She needed to understand not just what had happened, but why it had happened, to feel the weight of the land and the history it contained. The farmhouse was larger than the cabin, but showed more signs of neglect. Thomas had lived there alone for the last decade of his life, and his absence was evident in the peeling paint and overgrown gardens. but the bones of the house were solid, built with the same careful attention to quality that characterized everything her grandfather had touched. Sarah walked through the rooms slowly, seeing them not as the cluttered spaces of an elderly man's final years, but as the heart of a working farm where 3 generations had made their home. In the kitchen, she found more evidence of her grandfather's thoughtful nature. Recipe cards written in her grandmother's handwriting were still tucked into a wooden box beside the stove, organized by season and occasion. Notes about crop rotations and weather patterns covered the surface of a desk in what had once been a formal dining room, transformed into the nerve center of agricultural planning. Thomas had been a student of the land in the truest sense, understanding that successful farming required both scientific knowledge and intuitive wisdom passed down through generations. But it was in the attic that Sarah made her next significant discovery. Among boxes of family photographs and childhood memorabilia, she found a collection of letters that revealed another dimension of her grandfather's character. The correspondence was with various historical societies and museums, inquiries about the proper way to donate historical artifacts while maintaining family privacy. The letters were dated from the early 2000s, suggesting that Thomas had spent his final years wrestling with the question of what to do with the safe's contents. He had clearly researched the legal and ethical implications of possessing money and documents connected to Al Capone's organization, seeking advice from experts who could help him navigate the complex territory between historical preservation and family protection. One letter from the Illinois State Historical Society had been particularly helpful in clarifying Thomas's options. The museum director had explained that artifacts from the Prohibition era were considered historically significant regardless of their criminal origins, and that proper donation procedures could ensure both historical preservation and donor anonymity. The letter included detailed instructions for transferring ownership of such materials while protecting the privacy of the families involved. Sarah realized that her grandfather had been planning to donate the safe's contents to preserve their historical value while relieving his family of the burden of possessing them. His death had interrupted this process, leaving her to complete what he had begun. The discovery filled her with a sense of purpose that had been missing from her corporate career, a feeling that she was participating in something larger than personal success or financial gain. But even as the path forward began to clarify, Sarah found herself reluctant to simply follow her grandfather's plan without understanding all of her options. The money in the safe represented financial freedom that could allow her to leave the corporate world she'd grown increasingly dissatisfied with, to pursue something more meaningful and personally fulfilling. At the same time, she understood that using money connected to criminal activity, even decades-old criminal activity, would compromise her integrity in ways that might never be repairable. That evening, sitting in her grandfather's kitchen with the letters spread across the table, Sarah made her first concrete decision about the legacy she'd inherited. She would take time to fully understand the situation before making any irreversible choices. The safe had remained hidden for decades. It could remain hidden a little longer while she educated herself about the options and their implications. She began making a list of people she needed to consult: historians who specialized in the Prohibition era, lawyers who understood the complexities of inherited property with questionable origins, museum curators who could evaluate the historical significance of the documents and photographs. This wasn't a decision that could be made quickly or in isolation. It required careful research and thoughtful consideration of all the stakeholders involved. The process of investigation became absorbing in a way that reminded Sarah why she'd originally been drawn to problem-solving. But unlike the corporate puzzles she was used to tackling. This challenge engaged not just her analytical mind, but her emotions, her values, and her sense of connection to something larger than herself. For the first time in years, she was working on something that mattered deeply to her on a personal level. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself spending more time at the farm than in Chicago. She arranged to work remotely as much as possible, using video conferences and digital collaboration tools to maintain her client relationships, while immersing herself in research about her family's hidden history. Her assistant assumed she was managing the complexities of estate settlement, which was true enough, though the estate she was settling involved far more than anyone imagined. The rhythm of rural life began to influence Sarah's daily routine in ways she hadn't expected. She woke with the sunrise, worked during the productive morning hours, and spent afternoons walking the property or reading in the cabin where everything had begun. The constant pressure and artificial urgency of corporate life gave way to a more natural pace that allowed for deeper thinking and genuine reflection. During these weeks of research and contemplation, Sarah began to understand that the decision she faced wasn't really about money or historical artifacts. It was about identity, about choosing who she wanted to be and what values she wanted to live by. The successful consultant who had built her career on optimizing other people's businesses was being replaced by someone who cared more about authenticity and meaning than profit and recognition. The transformation wasn't sudden or dramatic, but it was profound. Sarah found herself questioning not just what to do with her grandfather's legacy, but what kind of legacy she wanted to create for herself. The corporate success that had once defined her began to feel hollow compared to the rich complexity of family history and the responsibility of stewarding something significant for future generations. As autumn deepened and the Illinois landscape settled into the quiet beauty of the dormant season, Sarah realized that her investigation into the safe's contents had become something much larger, an investigation into herself and the life she truly wanted to live. The discovery in the hidden room had awakened a part of her that had been sleeping for years, and there would be no going back to the simpler certainties of her previous existence. The first historian Sarah contacted was Dr. Margaret Fielding, a professor at Northwestern University who specialized in organized crime during the Prohibition era. Dr. Fielding's office was a cramped wonderland of books, documents, and photographs that chronicled Chicago's criminal underworld with academic precision. When Sarah called to request a meeting, she'd been deliberately vague about her reasons, mentioning only that she'd discovered some family documents that might have historical significance. Dr. Fielding was in her 60s, with steel-grey hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. Her office walls were covered with maps of Chicago from the 1920s, marked with pins indicating speakeasies, gambling houses, and the territories controlled by various criminal organizations. When Sarah mentioned finding documents connected to Al Capone's rural operations, the professor's casual demeanor shifted to focused attention. Most people don't realize how extensive Capone's network was beyond Chicago, Dr. Fielding explained, leaning forward in her chair. His organization controlled operations throughout Illinois, Wisconsin, and parts of Indiana. Rural properties were essential for storage, transportation, and as safe houses when things got hot in the city. Sarah had brought photocopies of some of the less sensitive documents from the safe, careful not to reveal anything that would identify her family or their property. Dr. Fielding examined them with the reverence of someone handling precious artifacts, which Sarah supposed they were. The professor's excitement was evident as she recognized the significance of what she was seeing. "These are extraordinary," Dr. Fielding said, studying a photograph that showed men loading trucks at what appeared to be a rural barn. "We have Very few primary source documents from Capone's rural operations. Most of the records were destroyed when the organization was dismantled, and the farmers involved rarely kept documentation for obvious reasons. The professor explained that Sarah's documents could provide crucial insights into how Capone's empire actually functioned outside the urban environment. The academic world had long speculated about the extent of rural involvement in Prohibition-era crime, but concrete evidence had been scarce. If properly preserved and studied, these materials could significantly advance historical understanding of the period. But Dr. Fielding also cautioned Sarah about the complexities of possessing such materials. There are legal questions about ownership of items obtained through criminal activity, even decades later, she explained. And there are ethical questions about how to preserve this history while respecting the privacy of the families involved. Sarah left the meeting with more questions than answers, but also with a deeper appreciation for the historical significance of what she'd inherited. The documents weren't just family artifacts, they were pieces of American history that could help scholars understand a crucial period in the nation's development. The weight of that responsibility was both inspiring and intimidating. Her next consultation was with James Morrison, no relation despite the shared surname, a lawyer who specialized in cases involving inherited property with complex legal histories. His downtown Chicago office was everything Sarah's grandfather's cabin was not. Modern, sterile, focused entirely on efficiency and billable hours. But Morrison's expertise was exactly what Sarah needed to understand her legal position. The good news, Morrison explained after reviewing Sarah's carefully sanitized description of the situation, is that the statute of limitations has long since expired on any criminal activity from the 1920s and 1930s. You can't be prosecuted for possessing items that were obtained illegally 8 decades ago. However, the lawyer continued, there were still complex questions about ownership and inheritance rights. If the materials had been stolen from their original owners, those owners or their heirs might theoretically have claims, though proving such claims after so many years would be virtually impossible. More practically, there were tax implications for inheriting items of significant value, regardless of how those items had been originally obtained. Morrison recommended that Sarah have the contents of the safe professionally appraised to determine their current value, both for tax purposes and to understand what she was actually dealing with. He also suggested consulting with experts in estate planning to structure any decisions about the materials in ways that would minimize legal and financial complications. The conversation with Morrison clarified some of Sarah's options, but also made her realize how many variables she still needed to consider. The simple discovery of a hidden safe had unleashed a cascade of legal, ethical, and practical questions that would require careful navigation. She was beginning to understand why her grandfather had spent years trying to decide what to do with this legacy. Sarah's third consultation was with Dr. Robert Kensington, the curator of American history at the Chicago History Museum. Dr. Kensington was younger than she'd expected, probably in his 40s, with an enthusiasm for historical preservation that was infectious. His office was less cluttered than Dr. Fielding's, but equally passionate, filled with carefully preserved artifacts that told the story of Chicago's complex past. When Sarah described the types of materials she'd discovered, Dr. Kensington's eyes lit up with professional excitement. The museum had been trying for years to develop a comprehensive exhibit about organized crime during Prohibition, but they'd been hampered by the scarcity of authentic artifacts from the period. Most items connected to criminal organizations had been destroyed, confiscated, or hidden so successfully that they'd never been recovered. What you're describing could be the centerpiece of a major exhibition, Dr. Kensington explained. Not just about Al Capone specifically, but about the broader social and economic forces that made Prohibition-era crime possible. The rural connections, the involvement of ordinary citizens, the moral complexities of survival during the Depression, these are stories that need to be told. The curator outlined several options for how Sarah could work with the museum if she decided to make the materials public. They could be donated anonymously, with the museum handling all publicity and interpretation while protecting her family's privacy. Alternatively, they could be loaned for specific exhibitions, allowing Sarah to maintain ownership while ensuring proper preservation and public access. Dr. Kensington also mentioned the possibility of creating a scholarship or educational program connected to the donation, a way to ensure that the historical significance of the materials would continue to benefit future generations of students and researchers. The idea appealed to Sarah, offering a way to transform her grandfather's burden into something positive and forward-looking. But even as Sarah explored these options, she found herself struggling with deeper questions about her own future. The research into her family's history had awakened interests and passions that had been dormant for years. She'd always been intellectually curious, but her corporate career had channeled that curiosity into narrow, profit-focused directions. Now she was discovering the satisfaction of learning for its own sake, of pursuing knowledge that served broader purposes than personal advancement. The contrast with her regular work became more stark with each passing day. Client meetings that had once energized her now felt superficial and repetitive. The corporate crises that demanded her attention seemed trivial compared to the historical mysteries she was unraveling. Sarah began to realize that her grandfather's legacy was changing, not just her understanding of the past, but her vision of the future. During one particularly difficult client meeting, as she listened to executives argue about quarterly projections and market positioning, Sarah found her mind wandering to the hidden room in the cabin and the journal that chronicled her family's moral struggles. The contrast between the boardroom's artificial urgency and the genuine weight of her grandfather's decisions was jarring. For the first time, she began seriously considering what it would mean to step away from the career she'd built. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Sarah had defined herself by her professional success for so long that imagining a different kind of life required fundamental changes in self-perception. But the weeks she'd spent researching her family's history had shown her what it felt like to work on something meaningful, to pursue knowledge and understanding rather than profit and recognition. That weekend, Sarah drove to the farm with a specific purpose. She wanted to spend time in the place where her great-grandfather had made his difficult choices, to understand not just what he'd decided, but how he'd found the courage to make such momentous decisions under pressure. The autumn landscape was at its peak, with maples and oaks displaying the full spectrum of fall colors against a crisp blue sky. She walked the property boundaries, following fence lines that had been established more than a century ago, trying to imagine what the land had looked like during the desperate years of the early 1930s. The soil was rich and black, perfect for corn and soybeans, but Sarah knew that even good land couldn't guarantee survival when market forces and weather patterns conspired against farmers. In the cabin, she read through her grandfather's journal again, paying attention not just to the facts he'd recorded, but to the emotions behind his words. Thomas had been wrestling with questions that had no clear answers, trying to balance competing moral obligations while protecting his family's future. His struggle was evident in every entry, the weight of inherited secrets pressing against his desire for a simpler, more honest life. Sarah realized that she was facing similar choices, though in a very different context. She had inherited not just money and documents, but the responsibility of deciding how to honor her family's sacrifices while creating a meaningful life for herself. The safe's contents were forcing her to confront fundamental questions about values, purpose, and the kind of person she wanted to be. As evening settled over the farm, Sarah sat on the cabin's small porch and made a decision that felt both inevitable and surprising. She would take a leave of absence from her consulting firm, officially to handle estate matters, but actually to give herself time to fully explore her options. The corporate world would still be there if she decided to return, but this opportunity to reshape her life might not come again. The decision brought with it a sense of relief that Sarah hadn't expected. For months, she'd been feeling increasingly disconnected from her work, going through the motions of professional success while yearning for something more substantial. Her grandfather's legacy had given her permission to explore that yearning, to discover what would happen if she followed her curiosity rather than her career plan. That night, sleeping in the farmhouse for the first time since childhood, Sarah dreamed of her grandfather not as the elderly man she'd known, but as a young farmer trying to save his family's land. In the dream, he was working in fields that stretched to the horizon, his hands strong and sure as he planted seeds that would grow into the future she now inhabited. When she woke, the morning light streaming through windows that had witnessed 3 generations of Morrison mornings, Sarah felt connected to something larger than herself. Part of a story that was still being written. The decision to take a leave of absence from her consulting firm required more courage than Sarah had anticipated. Her partners at McKinley & Associates were shocked when she requested an indefinite sabbatical, citing family estate matters that required her full attention. David Chen, the senior partner who had mentored her rise through the firm, looked genuinely concerned when she explained her need to step away from active client work. "Sarah, you're one of our most valuable assets," David said, leaning back in, his leather chair with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "The Hartwell account specifically requested you for their restructuring project. Are you sure this can't wait until after the holidays?" Sarah found herself unable to explain the real reason for her decision. How could she tell David that she'd discovered a hidden fortune connected to Al Capone, that her family's entire history had been built on a foundation she was only beginning to understand? Instead, she spoke vaguely about complex legal issues and the need to preserve family property, truths that were incomplete but not dishonest. The firm agreed to her sabbatical with reluctance, offering to keep her office available and her client relationships warm until she was ready to return. Sarah accepted their terms, while privately suspecting that her return was far from certain. The corporate world that had once felt like her natural habitat now seemed artificial and constraining, like an expensive suit that no longer fit properly. Her apartment in Chicago became a temporary base for deeper research into the historical context of her grandfather's secret. Sarah converted her dining room into a makeshift research center, covering the table with copies of documents from the safe, maps of Illinois during Prohibition, and books about the economic forces that had shaped rural America during the Great Depression. The modern space, with its clean lines and minimalist aesthetic, looked strange, filled with the detritus of historical investigation. The more Sarah learned about the period, the more she understood the impossible position her great-grandfather had faced. The agricultural crisis that preceded the stock market crash had been devastating for small farmers throughout the Midwest. Banks had called in loans that couldn't be repaid, foreclosing on properties that represented generations of family investment. The Morrison farm had been within months of foreclosure when Capone's representatives had appeared with their offer of salvation. Dr. Fielding had provided Sarah with additional context through phone conversations and email exchanges. The historian explained that cooperation with criminal organizations during Prohibition wasn't limited to farmers. Bankers, judges, police, officers and politicians throughout the region had been drawn into networks of corruption and collaboration, sometimes willingly and sometimes through intimidation or financial desperation. "Your great-grandfather wasn't unique," Dr. Fielding had said during one of their conversations. "He was part of a much larger pattern of ordinary people, making extraordinary choices under impossible circumstances. The moral complexity of these situations is exactly what makes them historically significant." But understanding the historical context didn't resolve Sarah's personal dilemma about what to do with her inheritance. The money in the safe represented financial freedom, but using it would mean accepting the moral ambiguity of its origins. The documents and photographs were historically priceless, but making them public would expose her family's long-hidden secrets to scrutiny and possible judgment. Sarah decided she needed to see more of the story for herself. She began visiting other farms in the region, introducing herself as a historian researching agricultural life during the Depression. Most of the current owners were 2 or 3 generations removed from the original families, but some still possessed oral histories and family documents that provided insights into the period. At the Kowalski farm, about 20 miles from her grandfather's property, Sarah met Elena Kowalski, a woman in her 70s whose grandfather had also faced foreclosure during the early 1930s. Elena's family had lost their farm, moving to Chicago, where they'd struggled through the Depression, working in factories and living in cramped tenements. The contrast with the Morrison family's experience was stark and painful. "My grandfather never got over losing the land," Elena told Sarah, serving coffee in a kitchen that belonged to a farm she'd bought back for the family 40 years later. "He used to say that a farmer without land is like a fish without water. It took our family 3 generations to get back to where we'd started." The conversation with Elena forced Sarah to confront an uncomfortable truth. Her family's survival had come at the cost of their integrity, but that survival had made possible everything good that had followed. Her grandfather's education, her father's opportunities, her own successful career, all of it was built on the foundation of her great-grandfather's morally ambiguous choice. At the same time, Sarah was learning more about the positive aspects of her family's history. In the local historical society's archives, she found records showing that Thomas Morrison had been quietly generous throughout his life, donating anonymously to families facing foreclosure, supporting the local school district during budget shortfalls, and helping neighbors through difficult times without seeking recognition or credit. The pattern suggested that her grandfather had found ways to use his family's survival guilt constructively, channeling his awareness of unearned advantages into helping others who faced similar challenges. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was a way of honoring the moral weight of his inheritance while creating positive outcomes for his community. Sarah began to see a possible path forward, inspired by her grandfather's example, but adapted to her own circumstances and capabilities. She could use her business skills and financial resources to create something meaningful, something that would honor her family's complex history while contributing to causes larger than personal comfort or success. The idea crystallized during a conversation with Dr. Kensington at the Chicago History Museum. The curator had mentioned the museum's ongoing struggles to fund educational programs for underserved communities, particularly initiatives that helped students understand connections between historical events and contemporary social issues. "We have excellent programs," Dr. Kensington explained, "but reaching students who don't have easy access to museums requires resources we don't currently have. Transportation, materials, teacher training, it all requires funding that's increasingly difficult to secure." Sarah found herself imagining a foundation that could bridge that gap, providing resources for historical education while supporting research into the kinds of complex moral questions her own family had faced. The foundation could fund scholarships, support community history projects, and help preserve the stories of ordinary people who had faced extraordinary circumstances. The concept excited her in ways that corporate consulting never had. Instead of optimizing existing systems for profit, she would be creating something entirely new, something designed to serve educational and social purposes rather than financial ones. The work would be challenging and meaningful, requiring all of her analytical skills while engaging her deeper values and interests. But even as Sarah developed this vision, she struggled with the question of funding. Using the money from Capone's safe would provide the foundation with substantial resources, but it would also mean building something positive on a foundation that was morally compromised. The alternative was to donate the historical materials while keeping the money separate, funding the foundation through legitimate means, even if that meant starting smaller and growing more slowly. The decision required Sarah to clarify her own values and priorities in ways she'd never been forced to do before. Her corporate career had operated within established ethical frameworks, following legal guidelines and industry standards that removed much of the moral complexity from daily decisions. But her current situation required her to create her own ethical framework, to decide what principles would guide her choices in uncharted territory. During a long weekend at the farm, Sarah made lists of pros and cons, trying to think through every angle of her decision. She walked the property boundaries repeatedly, following the same paths her grandfather had walked when wrestling with his own impossible choices. The autumn landscape was settling into dormancy, preparing for winter's challenges with the quiet endurance that had characterized rural life for generations. On Sunday evening, as she sat in the cabin with her grandfather's journal open beside her, Sarah realized that she'd been approaching the decision from the wrong angle. Instead of trying to find the perfect solution, she should be looking for the choice that best honored her family's sacrifices while serving purposes larger than personal comfort. Her great-grandfather had chosen survival over moral purity, accepting money from criminals to save his family's future. Her grandfather had chosen secrecy over disclosure, protecting his father's memory while carrying the burden of inherited guilt. Now it was Sarah's turn to choose, not between right and wrong, but between different ways of being responsible to the past and the future. The answer, when it came, felt both inevitable and surprising. Sarah would use the money from the safe to establish her foundation, but she would also tell the full story of its origins. The foundation's mission would include education about the moral complexities of historical events, helping students understand that the past was rarely as simple or clear-cut as textbooks suggested. By acknowledging the compromised origins of her resources while using them for educational purposes, Sarah could transform her family's burden into a tool for helping others grapple with similar moral complexities. The foundation would be built on honesty about its origins, making her great-grandfather's choice part of the story, rather than a secret to be hidden. The decision brought with it a sense of peace that Sarah hadn't felt since opening the safe. She was choosing to honor her family's sacrifices while creating something that could benefit future generations, transforming inherited guilt into productive action. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was an honest one, and honesty felt like the right foundation for whatever came next. That night, for the first time in weeks, Sarah slept deeply and dreamlessly in the farmhouse that had sheltered 3 generations of Morrisons. When she woke to sunrise streaming through the kitchen windows, she felt ready to begin the next chapter of her family's story, one that would acknowledge the past while building something better for the future. The process of establishing the Morrison Foundation required Sarah to navigate a labyrinth of legal requirements, tax implications, and ethical considerations that made her corporate consulting work seem straightforward by comparison. She rented a small office in downtown Springfield, Illinois, deliberately choosing a location that was closer to the farm than to Chicago's financial district. The space was modest but professional, with large windows that overlooked the Illinois State Capitol building, a reminder of the democratic ideals the foundation would serve. Sarah's first hire was Jessica Chen, a recent graduate from the University of Illinois with a master's degree in nonprofit administration and a passion for educational equity. Jessica was young, idealistic, and possessed the kind of energy that came from believing she could change the world through hard work and good intentions. She reminded Sarah of herself at that age, before corporate success had taught her to measure everything in terms of profit margins and efficiency metrics. "I've never worked for a foundation that was so specific about its mission from the beginning," Jessica said during her interview, reviewing the preliminary documents Sarah had prepared. "Most organizations evolve their focus over time, but you seem to have a very clear vision of what you want to accomplish." Sarah smiled, thinking about the hidden safe and the moral complexities that had shaped her vision. "Sometimes clarity comes from understanding exactly what problems you want to solve," she said, which was true enough without revealing the full story. The foundation's mission statement had taken weeks to craft, with Sarah working through dozens of drafts to capture the right balance of honesty and inspiration. The final version read, "The Morrison Foundation supports educational initiatives that help students understand the complex moral choices faced by ordinary people during challenging historical periods. We believe that studying the past honestly, including its moral ambiguities, helps prepare young people to navigate ethical challenges in their own lives." The language was carefully chosen to acknowledge complexity without sensationalizing it, to suggest the foundation's origins without explicit disclosure. Sarah planned to be more specific about the family history in appropriate contexts, but the mission statement needed to work for general audiences who weren't ready for the full story of Al Capone's hidden safe. Establishing the foundation's initial funding structure required delicate maneuvering with lawyers and accountants who specialized in non-profit law. Sarah couldn't simply transfer the money from the safe into the foundation's accounts. The bills were too old and too obviously connected to criminal activity to pass routine banking scrutiny. Instead, she worked with a currency specialist who helped her exchange the historical bills for modern currency through a process that documented their legitimate ownership while respecting their unusual origins. The exchange process revealed that the safe contained significantly more money than Sarah had initially estimated. What had appeared to be thousands of dollars in 1920s and 1930s currency translated to nearly $200,000 in contemporary value, even accounting for bills that were too damaged to exchange. Combined with the historical value of the documents and photographs, Sarah's inheritance represented a substantial foundation for the educational initiatives she envisioned. Dr. Fielding became an unofficial advisor to the foundation, helping Sarah understand how to frame the historical materials in ways that would serve educational purposes, while respecting the privacy of families who had been involved in Prohibition-era activities. The historian's enthusiasm for the project was infectious, and her academic credibility provided the foundation with scholarly legitimacy that would be crucial for gaining the trust of educators and institutions. "What you're proposing is exactly what historical education needs," Dr. Fielding explained during one of their planning meetings. "Too often, we present the past as a series of clear moral choices between obvious heroes and villains. Real history is messier, more complex, and ultimately more instructive because it shows how good people can find themselves in impossible situations. The first major initiative Sarah developed was a curriculum package for high school history. Teachers, focusing on the social and economic forces that shaped rural America during the Great Depression. The materials included primary source documents from the safe, carefully edited to protect family privacy, while illustrating the difficult choices faced by farmers and small business owners during the period. Working with Dr. Fielding and a team of education specialists, Sarah created lesson plans that encouraged students to grapple with moral complexity rather than simply memorizing dates and names. The curriculum asked students to consider questions like, when is it acceptable to break the law to protect your family? And how do economic pressures influence moral decision-making? These were the same questions Sarah's great-grandfather had faced, translated into educational frameworks that could help modern students develop critical thinking skills. The pilot program launched in 12 rural Illinois high schools, chosen specifically because their students came from farming communities that had experienced similar economic pressures in more recent years. Sarah wanted to test the curriculum with young people who could understand the agricultural context and relate to the challenges of rural economic survival. The initial response from teachers was overwhelmingly positive. Mark Harrison, a history teacher at Millbrook High School, called Sarah personally to express his excitement about the materials. "My students are actually arguing about historical events," he said, laughing. "They're taking sides, debating whether the farmers had other choices, connecting the Depression to modern economic challenges. This is exactly the kind of engagement we dream about, but rarely achieve." But the Foundation's work also generated unexpected controversy. A group of conservative parents in one of the pilot districts objected to curriculum materials that seemed to suggest criminal activity might sometimes be justified. They argued that schools should teach clear moral lessons rather than encouraging students to question legal and ethical authorities. The criticism forced Sarah to defend her educational philosophy in ways she hadn't anticipated. At a heated school board meeting in rural Oakfield, she found herself explaining why moral complexity was an essential part of historical education. "We're not encouraging students to break the law," Sarah told the packed auditorium, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "We're helping them understand that real moral choices are rarely simple, and that good people throughout history have faced situations where every available option carried significant costs. Learning to think through these complexities is preparation for citizenship in a democracy where voters must make decisions about complicated issues without easy answers." The debate revealed deep divisions within rural communities about how history should be taught and what values schools should promote. Some parents wanted education to reinforce traditional moral frameworks, while others supported approaches that encouraged critical thinking and nuanced analysis. Sarah found herself at the center of a broader cultural conversation about the purpose of education and the role of historical understanding in preparing young people for adult responsibilities. The controversy also forced Sarah to confront questions about her own motivations and methods. Was she using the Foundation to work through her family's guilt, or was she genuinely serving educational needs? Were the curriculum materials actually helping students, or were they simply making Sarah feel better about her inheritance? The questions were uncomfortable but necessary, pushing her to examine her assumptions and refine her approach. During this period of external pressure and internal questioning, Sarah spent increasing amounts of time at the farm, finding solace in the quiet routines of rural life and the physical connection to the land that had shaped her family's choices. She began making improvements to the property, not with the intention of selling, but with the goal of creating a retreat where she could think clearly about the foundation's future direction. The farmhouse needed extensive renovation, and Sarah threw herself into the project with an intensity that surprised her. She hired local contractors who understood old buildings, workers who shared stories about their own families' experiences during hard times. The conversations reminded her that her family's moral struggles weren't unique, that every generation faced choices between survival and principle, between protecting loved ones and maintaining perfect integrity. One evening, while reviewing foundation reports in the newly restored kitchen, Sarah received a call from Jessica with news that would change everything. A documentary filmmaker had heard about the Morrison Foundation's unusual approach to historical education and wanted to feature the organization in a film about innovative teaching methods. "She's won Emmy Awards," Jessica said, her excitement evident even over the phone. "The documentary would give us national exposure, potentially reaching thousands of educators who could use our materials. But she wants to know more about the foundation's origins, about what inspired you to focus on moral complexity in historical education." Sarah felt her chest tighten as she considered the implications. National exposure would amplify the foundation's impact, potentially helping thousands of students develop critical thinking skills about moral complexity. But it would also mean scrutiny of her family's history, questions about the foundation's funding sources, and possible revelation of secrets that 3 generations of Morrisons had worked to protect. The decision felt eerily similar to the choices her great-grandfather and grandfather had faced. How much risk was acceptable to achieve important goals? How much exposure could the family withstand in service of larger purposes? The parallel wasn't exact, but the underlying tension between personal privacy and public benefit was unmistakable. Sarah walked out to the cabin, now fully restored and serving as her private office, and sat in the hidden room that had started everything. The safe stood open now, empty of its original contents, but still holding the weight of family history. She thought about her great-grandfather's courage in accepting tainted money to save his family's future, about her grandfather's wisdom in protecting that secret while finding ways to give back to his community. Now it was her turn to choose between safety and significance, between protecting her family's privacy and maximizing the foundation's potential impact. The documentary could transform the Morrison Foundation from a small regional initiative into a national model for historical education. But it would also mean opening her family's story to public examination and possible judgment. The weight of the decision kept Sarah awake most of that night, walking the property under stars that had witnessed 3 generations of Morrison struggles. By morning, she had reached a conclusion that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She would cooperate with the documentary, but on her own terms, telling her family's story honestly while maintaining control over how it was presented. The choice represented a fundamental shift in how Sarah understood her relationship to her inheritance. Instead of seeing the family secrets as burdens to be managed, she was beginning to see them as resources for helping others understand the complexity of moral choice. Her great-grandfather's compromise with Al Capone's organization wasn't a source of shame, but a powerful example of how ordinary people navigate impossible circumstances. The documentary filmmaker, Rebecca Martinez, arrived at the farm on a crisp October morning with a small crew and an intensity that reminded Sarah of her former corporate self. Rebecca was in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of her surroundings. Her reputation for uncovering hidden stories was legendary in educational circles, and Sarah had spent sleepless nights wondering how much of the truth she was prepared to reveal. I've been following innovative education initiatives for 15 years, Rebecca said, as they walked toward the farmhouse, her camera operator trailing behind to capture establishing shots. But I've never encountered a foundation with such a specific focus on moral complexity. Most educational nonprofits talk about critical thinking in general terms. You're asking students to grapple with the kinds of ethical dilemmas that most adults spend their lives avoiding. Sarah had prepared extensively for this moment, working with Jessica and Dr. Fielding to develop a narrative that was honest about the Foundation's origins, without immediately revealing the full scope of her family's secrets. The strategy was to begin with broader themes about rural history and economic pressure, gradually building toward the more dramatic revelations as Rebecca demonstrated her commitment to respectful storytelling. "My family has farmed this land for 3 generations, Sarah began, leading Rebecca through the restored farmhouse. When I inherited the property, I discovered that my ancestors faced the same kinds of impossible choices that we're asking students to analyze. The foundation grew out of my realization that these moral complexities aren't abstract philosophical problems. They're real situations that real people have navigated throughout American history." Rebecca's questions were probing, but not aggressive, revealing a journalist's instinct for finding the deeper story without alienating her subjects. She asked about Sarah's transition from corporate consulting to non-profit work, about the specific historical period that had inspired the Foundation's curriculum, and about the response from educators and communities. The filming process stretched over 3 days, with Rebecca's crew capturing classroom sessions where students debated moral dilemmas, interviews with teachers who had implemented the curriculum, and extensive conversations with Sarah about her educational philosophy. But Sarah could sense Rebecca's growing awareness that there was more to the story than she was being told. On the second day, while filming in the cabin that served as Sarah's office, Rebecca noticed details that didn't quite fit the narrative. Of a simple family farm, the building was clearly old, but had been recently and expensively restored. The security system was more sophisticated than most rural properties warranted, and there were photographs on the walls that showed the property in different eras, images that suggested a more complex history than Sarah had initially revealed. "This cabin feels significant to you," Rebecca observed during a break in filming. "There's something about this space that connects to your work in ways you haven't explained yet." Sarah felt the familiar tension between protection and disclosure that had characterized her family's relationship with their secrets for 3 generations. Rebecca had proven herself to be thoughtful and respectful, but revealing the truth about Al Capone's safe would fundamentally change the documentary's focus and potentially expose the Foundation to scrutiny it wasn't prepared to handle. That evening, Sarah invited Rebecca to dinner at the farmhouse, hoping that a more intimate setting might help her gauge whether the filmmaker could be trusted with the full story. They sat in the restored kitchen, eating soup that Sarah had learned to make from her grandmother's recipe cards, while Rebecca shared stories about other documentaries she'd produced. "I made a film about a Holocaust survivor who had hidden his past for 60 years, Rebecca said, her voice thoughtful. He was terrified that his story would somehow diminish the suffering of others, that his particular experience wouldn't be representative enough to deserve attention. But when the film aired, we heard from hundreds of people who said his story had helped them understand their own family histories, their own moral struggles." The parallel wasn't lost on Sarah. She realized that Rebecca understood the delicate balance between personal privacy and public value, between protecting individual families and serving broader educational purposes. The documentary could honor her family's story while using it to help others grapple with similar moral complexities. But even as Sarah considered revealing more of the truth, external pressures began threatening the Foundation's stability. The controversy that had begun with conservative parents in rural school districts was spreading through social media, where the Foundation's curriculum was being characterized as an attack on traditional values and moral clarity. A blog post titled "Teaching Moral Relativism to Our Children" had gone viral, describing the Morrison Foundation's materials as dangerous propaganda that encouraged students to question legal authority and moral absolutes. The post included quotes from the curriculum taken out of context, making thoughtful exploration of historical complexity appear like advocacy for criminal behavior. Jessica called Sarah in panic after discovering that the Foundation's email system had been overwhelmed with angry messages from people who had never seen the actual curriculum materials, but had strong opinions about what they represented. Some of the messages contained threats, not just against the Foundation, but against Sarah personally. "We're getting calls from school districts wanting to cancel their participation in the pilot program," Jessica reported, her usual optimism replaced by worry. "The superintendent in Millbrook says the school board is meeting tomorrow night to discuss whether the curriculum aligns with community values." Sarah felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach, the same sensation she'd experienced during corporate crises when external forces threatened carefully built systems. But this felt more personal, more threatening to things that mattered beyond financial success. The Foundation represented her attempt to transform her family's moral burden into something positive, and its destruction would feel like a betrayal of her ancestors' sacrifices. Rebecca's crew had documented some of the controversy, interviewing parents and school board members who expressed concerns about the curriculum's approach. But Rebecca herself seemed more interested in understanding the underlying tensions than in sensationalizing the conflict. "Every significant educational innovation faces resistance," Rebecca told Sarah as they reviewed footage in the cabin. "The question isn't whether there will be opposition, but whether the work is important enough to justify pushing through it." The comment forced Sarah to confront fundamental questions about her commitment to the Foundation's mission. Was she prepared to defend the organization publicly, even if it meant revealing uncomfortable truths about her family's history? Could she maintain her commitment to moral complexity while under attack from people who preferred simple answers? That night, alone in the farmhouse with the weight of 3 generations of family secrets pressing down on her, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. She would tell Rebecca the complete truth about the safe, the money, and her family's connection to Al Capone's organization. The documentary would become not just about innovative education, but about how families deal with morally complex inheritances across generations. The decision brought immediate relief mixed with terror. Sarah had spent so much energy protecting her family's secrets that she'd forgotten how exhausting secrecy could be. But revealing the truth would also expose her to judgment and criticism from people who might not understand the impossible circumstances her great-grandfather had faced. The next morning, Sarah led Rebecca to the hidden room behind the restored desk in the cabin. The safe stood open now, empty but still imposing, its steel surface bearing the initials that had started everything. Sarah handed Rebecca her grandfather's journal, watching the filmmaker's expression change as she realized the significance of what she was seeing. "My great-grandfather stored money for Al Capone's organization during Prohibition," Sarah said simply. "The Foundation is funded by that money, and our curriculum is based on the moral questions my family has been grappling with for 3 generations. Rebecca was quiet for a long time, reading through the journal entries and examining the photographs Sarah had preserved from the safe's contents. When she finally looked up, her expression was thoughtful rather than shocked. "This changes everything about the documentary," Rebecca said, "but it also makes it infinitely more powerful. You're not just teaching about moral complexity in the abstract. You're sharing your family's actual experience with impossible choices. The revelation transformed the filming process over the final day. Rebecca's questions became more probing, but also more respectful, acknowledging the courage required to reveal family secrets for educational purposes. The documentary would now tell the story of how historical trauma and moral complexity could be transformed into tools for helping others navigate similar challenges. But even as Sarah felt relief at finally sharing her burden, the external pressures on the foundation continued to intensify. A conservative advocacy group had organized a campaign to pressure school districts to reject the curriculum, characterizing it as an attack on law enforcement and traditional morality. Local news stations were covering the controversy, with talking heads debating whether schools should teach moral complexity or stick to clear distinctions between right and wrong. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she was facing public criticism for the same kinds of moral compromises her great-grandfather had made in private. The difference was that she had chosen transparency over secrecy, deciding that the educational value of her family's story outweighed the risks of public exposure. As Rebecca's crew packed their equipment and prepared to leave, Sarah felt both exhausted and exhilarated. The documentary would take months to complete, but the process of telling her story had already transformed her understanding of her family's legacy. Instead of carrying the burden of secrets alone, she was now sharing that weight with others who could help transform it into something positive. The Foundation's future remained uncertain, threatened by external opposition and internal doubts about whether moral complexity could be taught effectively in polarized times. But Sarah had made her choice to follow her great-grandfather's example of accepting difficult consequences in service of larger purposes. Whether that choice would ultimately prove wise remained to be seen, but it felt authentic in ways that her corporate success never had. Standing in the cabin as Rebecca's van disappeared down the gravel road, Sarah realized that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Her family's secrets were no longer secrets, and the Foundation's mission had evolved from abstract educational theory to deeply personal testimony about the complexity of moral choice. The next phase of her journey would require new kinds of courage, but she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The school board meeting in Millbrook High School's gymnasium was packed beyond capacity, with folding chairs arranged in tight rows and people standing along the walls when the seating ran out. Sarah had never experienced anything like the tension that filled the room, a crackling energy that spoke of fundamental disagreements about values, education, and the role of schools in shaping young minds. She sat in the front row, having been invited to defend the Foundation's curriculum, while Jessica nervously reviewed her notes beside her. The board members looked uncomfortable as they called the meeting to order, clearly aware that their small rural district had become the focal point of a much larger cultural debate. Board Chair Margaret Hensley, a retired teacher in her 70s, explained that the evening's discussion would focus on whether Millbrook should continue participating in the Morrison Foundation's pilot program. "We've received numerous communications from community members expressing concerns about the curriculum materials," Hensley said, her voice carefully neutral. "We've also heard from educators who support the program. Tonight, we want to hear from all stakeholders before making our decision." The first speakers were parents who opposed the curriculum, and their passion was unmistakable. Karen Bradley, whose son was in Mark Harrison's history class, stood at the podium with printed materials from the Foundation's lesson plans, highlighting sections she found objectionable. "Look at this question," Bradley said, reading from one of the handouts. "When economic survival is at stake, what moral compromises might be justified? This isn't education. This is asking our children to rationalize criminal behavior. Schools should teach right from wrong, not encourage students to find excuses for breaking the law. Another parent, Tom Mitchell, expressed similar concerns with even more intensity. My grandfather was a farmer during the Depression, and he never compromised his principles, no matter how hard things got. There were legal ways to get help, moral ways to survive difficult times. Teaching kids that crime might be justified is dangerous and wrong. Sarah listened to each speaker with growing unease, recognizing that their concerns weren't entirely unreasonable. The curriculum did ask students to consider situations where law and morality might conflict, and for people who believed in absolute moral standards, such questions could feel threatening to their children's development. But when Mark Harrison was called to speak, he presented a different perspective that reminded Sarah why she'd been drawn to educational work in the first place. Harrison was young, probably in his early 30s, with the earnest enthusiasm of someone who still believed teaching could change the world. "I've been using the Morrison Foundation materials for 2 months," Harrison said, facing the packed gymnasium with confidence. "What I've seen is students engaging with history in ways they never have before. Instead of memorizing facts for tests, they're actually thinking about the choices people made and why they made them." Harrison described specific examples of how the curriculum had transformed classroom discussions. Students were connecting Depression-era challenges to modern economic pressures their own families faced. They were debating agricultural policies, analyzing the effectiveness of government programs, and developing nuanced understanding of how social and economic forces influence individual behavior. One of my students wrote an essay comparing her grandfather's decision to sell the family farm to a housing developer with the choices farmers made during the Depression. Harrison continued, "She wasn't justifying either decision, but she was understanding the complexity of situations where all available options carry significant costs. That's exactly the kind of critical thinking we want students to develop." When Sarah was finally called to speak, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, people who had strong opinions about her work based on incomplete information and cultural assumptions. She had prepared extensively for this moment, but standing at the podium, in front of so many community members, felt more intimidating than any corporate boardroom presentation. "I understand the concerns that have been raised," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "As a parent myself, I would want to know exactly what my children were learning and why." She paused, realizing she'd just claimed to be a parent when she wasn't, but the lie felt right in the context of connecting with the audience's concerns. Sarah decided to tell her family's story, not completely but more fully than she'd originally planned. She described her great-grandfather's situation during the Depression, the impossible choice between losing the family farm and accepting money from questionable sources. She explained how that moral complexity had shaped 3 generations of her family's thinking about right and wrong. "The curriculum doesn't tell students what to think about these situations," Sarah continued. "It asks them to think carefully about the factors that influence moral decision-making. We're not teaching that crime is acceptable, we're teaching that real moral choices are rarely simple, and that understanding complexity helps young people make better decisions when they face difficult situations themselves." The response from the audience was mixed, with some nodding in understanding, while others appeared unconvinced. But Sarah could sense a shift in the room's energy, a recognition that she was speaking from personal experience rather than abstract educational theory. Dr. Fielding had driven down from Northwestern to support the foundation, and her academic credentials lent credibility to Sarah's arguments. The historian explained how the curriculum fit within broader trends in historical education, emphasizing primary source analysis and critical thinking over rote memorization. Historical education has evolved significantly over the past decade, Dr. Fielding told the board. We've moved away from presenting the past as a series of simple moral lessons toward helping students understand the complexity of historical events. This approach better prepares young people for citizenship in a democracy where they'll need to analyze complex issues and make informed decisions about complicated problems. But the opposition wasn't swayed by academic arguments. Reverend James Coleman from the First Baptist Church stood to express concerns that went beyond specific curriculum materials to fundamental questions about moral education. There are absolute moral truths, Coleman said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in the pulpit. Our children need to learn that some things are simply right and others are simply wrong. When we start teaching that morality depends on circumstances, we're undermining the foundation of civilized society. The debate continued for nearly 3 hours, with speakers on both sides becoming increasingly passionate as the evening progressed. Sarah began to understand that the controversy wasn't really about her curriculum, but about deeper cultural divisions regarding moral authority, the purpose of education, and the role of schools in transmitting values. When the public comment period finally ended, the school board retreated to executive session to discuss their decision. Sarah, Jessica, and their supporters waited in the hallway, uncertain about the outcome, but aware that whatever happened in Millbrook would influence other districts considering the program. Mark Harrison joined them in the hallway, looking exhausted, but determined. Regardless of what the board decides, he told Sarah, this curriculum has changed how I think about teaching history. Even if we can't use it officially, I'm going to find ways to incorporate these approaches into my classes. The comment reminded Sarah that the Foundation's impact couldn't be measured solely by official adoptions or board resolutions. Individual teachers who had experienced the materials would carry those ideas forward, influencing thousands of students over the course of their careers. The ripple effects of educational innovation often worked through informal networks rather than formal approvals. When the board returned from executive session, their faces revealed nothing about their decision. Margaret Hensley read a prepared statement that attempted to acknowledge all perspectives while announcing their conclusion. After careful deliberation, the Millbrook School Board has decided to continue participating in the Morrison Foundation pilot program for the remainder of the current semester, Hensley announced. However, we will require additional oversight of the curriculum implementation and regular reports on student and parent responses to the materials. The decision represented a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but allowed the program to continue under increased scrutiny. Sarah felt relief mixed with concern about the additional oversight requirements, understanding that the foundation would need to prove its value repeatedly in an environment of persistent skepticism. As people filed out of the gymnasium, Sarah was approached by several community members who wanted to express private support for the program. A farmer named Robert Chen told her that his daughter had become fascinated with agricultural history after participating in the curriculum, asking questions about their family's experiences during various economic downturns. She's thinking about studying agricultural economics in college, Chen said. Before this class, she thought farming was boring and old-fashioned. Now she understands that agriculture is connected to everything: economics, politics, social change. That's exactly what education should do. But Sarah was also approached by parents who remained opposed to the program, expressing concerns in more personal terms than they'd used during the public meeting. These conversations reminded her that education touches on parents' deepest fears and hopes for their children, and that even well-intentioned innovations could feel threatening to families with different values and priorities. The drive back to the farm felt longer than usual, with Sarah and Jessica processing the evening's events in relative silence. The foundation had survived its first major test, but the experience had revealed how vulnerable educational innovation could be to cultural and political pressures. "I keep thinking about what Reverend Coleman said about absolute moral truths," Jessica finally said as they turned onto the gravel road leading to the farmhouse. "Do you think we're really undermining moral education, or are we just approaching it differently?" Sarah considered the question as they pulled into the driveway, looking at the farmhouse, where 3 generations of her family had grappled with moral complexity. Her great-grandfather had believed in absolute moral truths, too, until circumstances forced him to choose between competing values. Her grandfather had maintained his integrity while carrying the burden of inherited compromise. "I think we're teaching that moral truth is more complex than simple rules can capture," Sarah finally answered. "That doesn't mean anything goes. It means that applying moral principles to real situations requires wisdom, not just memorization." The school board meeting had clarified something important for Sarah about the Foundation's mission. They weren't just teaching historical thinking skills or promoting academic innovation. They were participating in a broader cultural conversation about how society prepares young people for moral citizenship, about whether education should provide answers or teach students to ask better questions. The controversy would continue, Sarah realized, because the Foundation had touched on fundamental disagreements about human nature, moral development, and the purpose of education. But that controversy might also be the source of the program's ultimate impact, forcing communities to engage in exactly the kinds of complex moral discussions the curriculum was designed to promote. Standing in the cabin later that night, looking at the empty safe that had started everything, Sarah felt a deep sense of continuity with her ancestors who had faced their own impossible choices. The Foundation represented her generation's attempt to transform inherited moral complexity into something constructive, and the resistance they faced was part of that process. The documentary aired on PBS 6 months later during a cold February evening when snow covered the Illinois farmland like a blanket of forgiveness. Sarah watched from her grandfather's farmhouse, with Jessica, Dr. Fielding, and a handful of teachers who had become the Foundation's most dedicated supporters. The living room felt intimate compared to the national audience that would witness her family's secrets for the first time. Rebecca Martinez had crafted the story with remarkable sensitivity, weaving together interviews, archival footage, and scenes from the farm to create a narrative that honored both the historical significance and the human cost of moral complexity. The documentary began with students debating ethical dilemmas in Mark Harrison's classroom, their passionate arguments revealing how deeply they'd engaged with questions their grandparents had faced in reality. But it was when the camera moved to the hidden room in the cabin, revealing the empty safe with Al Capone's initials, that Sarah felt the full weight of what she'd chosen to share. Her voice narrated the discovery, explaining how a simple inheritance had forced her to confront generations of family secrets and transform them into educational tools. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the stories we're most ashamed to tell, Sarah heard herself saying on screen. My great-grandfather wasn't a criminal, but he made choices that compromised his principles to save his family's future. Understanding those choices rather than judging them has taught me more about moral courage than any textbook ever could. The documentary's impact was immediate and far-reaching. Within days of the broadcast, the Morrison Foundation's website was overwhelmed with inquiries from educators across the country. Teachers in urban districts facing economic pressures, rural communities dealing with agricultural challenges, and suburban schools serving families affected by corporate downsizing all expressed interest in curriculum materials that acknowledged the complexity of moral decision-making. But the national exposure also intensified the opposition the foundation faced. Conservative commentators characterized the documentary as dangerous propaganda, while progressive critics argued that Sarah was romanticizing criminal behavior. The foundation found itself at the center of a cultural debate that extended far beyond education into fundamental questions about morality, history, and social responsibility. The controversy reached its peak when a prominent cable news pundit devoted an entire segment to attacking the Foundation's approach, arguing that teaching moral complexity was equivalent to moral relativism. The segment included selectively edited clips from the documentary and interviews with parents who opposed the curriculum, creating a narrative that portrayed Sarah as a wealthy liberal elite, undermining traditional values. Sarah watched the segment from her Chicago office, which she'd maintained as the foundation grew beyond what could be managed from the farm. The attacks were personal and painful, questioning not just her educational philosophy, but her character and motivations. For a moment, she understood why her grandfather had chosen secrecy over exposure, why he'd preferred carrying the burden alone rather than subjecting the family to public judgment. The criticism extended beyond television commentary to social media platforms, where hashtags like Morrison scandal and teaching crime began trending. Anonymous accounts shared conspiracy theories about Sarah's motivations, claiming she was part of a broader effort to normalize criminal behavior among young people. The vitriol was intense and personal, targeting not just her work, but her appearance, her background, and her family's history. But the next morning brought a reminder of why the work mattered. Jessica burst into the office with a stack of letters from teachers and students across the country, responses to the documentary that had been arriving by the hundreds. A history teacher in Detroit wrote about how the curriculum had helped her students understand their own family's experiences with economic hardship. A student in rural Montana described how studying moral complexity had helped him process his grandfather's service in Vietnam and the difficult choices soldiers faced in wartime. One letter from a high school senior in Oregon particularly moved Sarah. The student wrote, "My dad lost his job when the factory closed, and he's been talking about taking work that might not be completely legal to keep our house. After studying your family's story, I understand that good people sometimes face impossible choices, but I also understand that those choices have consequences that last for generations. I'm going to talk to my dad about finding legal alternatives, even if they're harder." Another letter came from a teacher in rural Kentucky whose own family had been involved in moonshining during Prohibition. "Your documentary gave me permission to discuss my family's history with my students," she wrote. "For generations we've carried shame about our ancestors' choices, but now I understand that their decisions were products of desperation and systemic failures, not moral deficiency. Teaching this complexity has transformed my classroom." The letter reminded Sarah that education's true impact couldn't be measured in test scores or graduation rates, but in the wisdom students gained to navigate their own moral challenges. The foundation wasn't just teaching history, it was helping young people develop the critical thinking skills they'd need to make ethical decisions throughout their lives. As the documentary's influence spread, unexpected allies emerged. A coalition of historians published an open letter defending the Foundation's approach, arguing that understanding moral complexity was essential for democratic citizenship. Military veterans organizations expressed support for educational materials that acknowledged the difficult choices people face under pressure. Even some religious leaders argued that grappling with moral complexity was consistent with traditions of ethical reflection and spiritual growth. The foundation received an endorsement from an unexpected source when Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic priest who worked with immigrant communities, spoke about the curriculum during a widely viewed television interview. Understanding moral complexity doesn't mean abandoning moral principles, he explained. It means recognizing that applying those principles to real-world situations requires wisdom, compassion, and humility. The Morrison Foundation is helping young people develop exactly those qualities. Corporate leaders also began reaching out to the foundation, not to criticize, but to express support. Several CEOs mentioned that they wished their employees had the kind of ethical reasoning skills the curriculum was designed to develop. A technology executive wrote to Sarah, explaining that his company's most difficult challenges involved balancing profit motives with social responsibility, exactly the kind of complex thinking the foundation was promoting. The foundation's curriculum was eventually adopted by over 200 school districts across 30 states, though not without continued resistance and ongoing debate. Each implementation required careful navigation of local concerns and values, with Sarah and her growing team learning to adapt their materials for different communities while maintaining the core commitment to moral complexity. The success brought new challenges that Sarah hadn't anticipated. Media attention attracted corporate donors who wanted to associate their brands with educational innovation, but their offers often came with expectations that would compromise the foundation's independence. Technology companies proposed digitizing the curriculum for mass distribution, while publishing houses sought licensing deals that would give them control over content development. Sarah found herself in situations remarkably similar to those her great-grandfather had faced, though the stakes were different. The foundation needed resources to expand its impact, but accepting certain types of funding would require moral compromises that could undermine its educational mission. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was navigating ethical dilemmas while teaching others to navigate ethical dilemmas. After extensive consultation with the Foundation's board and advisors, Sarah decided to maintain strict independence by accepting only unrestricted donations from sources that aligned with the Foundation's values. The decision limited their growth potential but preserved their ability to focus on educational quality rather than commercial interests. 3 years after opening the safe, Sarah stood once again in the hidden room of the cabin, but this time she wasn't alone. A group of high school students from various states had come to the farm for the Foundation's first annual Summer Institute, a program that brought together young people interested in studying moral complexity in historical and contemporary contexts. The students were examining reproductions of documents from the safe, analyzing the economic pressures that had shaped her great-grandfather's choices. But they were also connecting those historical events to modern challenges: immigration policy, environmental protection, economic inequality, and global conflicts that required citizens to balance competing moral claims. The money in this safe saved one family's farm, said Maria Santos, a student from Texas whose own family had faced deportation threats. But it came from an organization that caused terrible harm to other families. How do we weigh those competing claims? How do we honor our ancestors' sacrifices while acknowledging the cost of their choices? David Kim, a student from Seattle, raised his hand thoughtfully. What strikes me is how economic systems create these impossible situations. My parents came here as refugees, and they've had to make compromises about working conditions and labor rights just to survive. The specific circumstances are different from the 1930s, but the underlying pressures are the same. Another student, Ashley Martinez from Arizona, connected the discussion to contemporary immigration policy. My grandmother crossed the border illegally when she was 16, fleeing violence in her home country. She broke the law, but she was trying to save her life. How do we evaluate that choice using the same framework we're applying to your great-grandfathers? Decisions? Sarah smiled as she listened to the discussion, recognizing the same questions that had kept her grandfather awake at night and driven her own transformation from corporate consultant to educational innovator. The students were learning not just to analyze historical events, but to develop frameworks for approaching the moral challenges they would face in their own lives. The Summer Institute had become the Foundation's flagship program, attracting applications from across the country and internationally. Students spent 2 weeks on the farm, engaging in intensive seminars about moral philosophy, historical analysis, and contemporary ethical challenges. They also participated in community service projects that connected their learning to practical action, working with local food banks, environmental restoration projects, and literacy programs. One of the most powerful components of the Institute was a storytelling project where students researched and shared their own family's moral complexities. The presentations revealed universal patterns of difficult choices across different cultures, time periods, and circumstances. Students spoke about family members who had faced impossible decisions during wars, economic depressions, natural disasters, and social upheavals. As the Summer Institute concluded, Sarah realized that her family's legacy had evolved far beyond anything her great-grandfather could have imagined. The money that had once represented a shameful compromise had become the foundation for educational programs that helped young people develop moral courage and critical thinking skills. The secrets that had burdened 3 generations had been transformed into tools for helping others navigate ethical complexity. The work was far from finished. Political pressures continued to threaten funding for programs that encouraged complex thinking rather than simple answers. Cultural divisions made it difficult to build consensus around educational approaches that acknowledged moral ambiguity. And new challenges, artificial intelligence, climate change, global inequality, required fresh thinking about how to prepare young people for unprecedented ethical dilemmas. But standing in the cabin where it all began, surrounded by students who represented the Foundation's ultimate purpose, Sarah felt a deep sense of connection to her ancestors and confidence in the path forward. Her great-grandfather had saved the family farm through morally complex choices. Her grandfather had protected those secrets while finding ways to serve his community. Now she was transforming that inheritance into something that could benefit countless families facing their own impossible decisions. The evening sun slanted through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor where 3 generations of Morrisons had wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. In those shadows, Sarah could see the outlines of future challenges and opportunities, the ongoing work of helping young people develop the wisdom to navigate a complex world with integrity and compassion. If this story of transformation from family secrets to educational innovation has moved you, if you believe that understanding moral complexity is essential for navigating our challenging world, then please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with others who might benefit from understanding that the most difficult choices often lead to the most meaningful growth. And remember that every family carries stories of moral complexity. The question isn't whether our ancestors made perfect choices, but whether we can learn from their struggles to make better choices ourselves. The work of education continues, one difficult conversation at a time, one student's awakening at a time, one generation's wisdom building upon the last. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery, and we hope you'll continue to explore with us the complex moral landscape that shapes our shared human experience.